again, and this is the second class in the series, Who's Who and What's What in Jewish Philosophy. And today's topic is Maimonides amongst the mystics. And I'm going to start with a bold claim. Each of the three Abrahamic civilizations, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, went through a crisis, a major set of controversies concerning the status of reason and of philosophy. And this was in roughly the 11th, 12th, and then especially the 13th centuries. And these crises and controversies had to do with the revival of Aristotelianism. I'll say a bit more about that shortly. But here's my claim is that each of the civilizations resolved this crisis in a different way. It took a very similar form, but they resolved it differently. And the way in which each of the civilizations resolved that crisis gave rise to some of the main conditions that would later determine whether and how the civilization in question would undergo the scientific revolution. So the way in which the Islamic civilization resolved the crisis, I'll say a bit more about that later on, basically made the scientific revolution impossible. Even though they were very scientifically advanced in the 11th and 12th centuries. But there was a clamping down on philosophy that made it unlikely or impossible that something new was going to really emerge after that point. Christianity had a sort of institutional resolution of the problem, which was ultimately very successful, which involved setting up the university as a corporate entity that had a certain amount of independence that took some time to develop, but it would ultimately create the institutional conditions under which a certain kind of inquiry could develop. Although it's also true that some of the very first people in the scientific revolution, they may have been educated at the universities, they weren't themselves employed there, that came a little bit later. Nevertheless, they were educated in a certain way of critical thinking. Among the Jews, the crucial issue is Maimonides. What to do with Maimonides. And Maimonides is really quite unique when you look at all these three civilizations. It's the only case in which arguably the most radical rationalist is at the same time a canonical and central authoritative legal figure. So that no matter how much he might be criticized, ultimately he was there for good. That did not create an institutional framework for critical thinking, but it did mean that for individuals who were interested in philosophical and scientific approaches, Maimonides was always there on the shelf. Maimonides would never leave the Jewish bookshelf. Whereas in the Islamic case, I believe, the main Islamic rationalists were simply not on the bookshelf anymore. So that made a huge difference. So that's my big claim. I'm going to talk mainly about the Jewish case, but I think it's interesting to keep in mind the other two cases as well. So what were the Maimonidean controversies about? And the controversies went on for a long time. I've given an additional little handout here if you have, just to give you a sense of time. I'm not going to go through all of this, but so the revival of Aristotelianism starts in the 10th century among the Islamic philosophers. And why is that important? Well, until now, and this is what we talked about last time, philosophy in Islam, Christianity, and Judaism was primarily Platonic. And after Philo of Alexandria, whom we talked about last time, there were various ways of reconciling Platonism with these Abrahamic religions. So much so that it was said already in antiquity that Plato must have read the books of Moses. Otherwise, how could he have come up with things that were so close to Judaism or Christianity? And their thought was that Plato was committed to a transcendent single God. You could sort of make that out. Plato's God also creates the world, although whether he creates it from nothing, creates it from matter, that's another question. And Plato is committed to the world of ideas. Those are the true realities, the ideas. It's a spiritual world that transcends the senses. And that too is something to which Judaism and Christianity had become committed over the years, and Islam as well. Had a very Platonic, philosophical and mystical tradition. Aristotle, of course, is very critical of Plato's conception of the ideas as being separate entirely from matter. He also is one of the great proponents of physical science, in which Plato and Socrates do not seem to have taken a great deal of interest. However, first of all, certain works that are very Platonic were falsely attributed to Aristotle. So there's a work known as the Theology of Aristotle that was available certainly in Arabic throughout the Middle Ages, and then later maybe in other languages too. We know now that it is not by Aristotle. It is a sort of summary of the Neoplatonic work of Plotinus. But nevertheless, medieval Muslims and Jews and some Christians thought that it was by Aristotle. So they thought that Aristotle was committed, in addition to what he thought about this world, as it were, down here, below the moon, the sublunar realm, which is describable in physical terms. They thought that Aristotle was also committed to something of a world of ideas that emanates from the one transcendent God. So they had a certain Aristotelianism, but they were also putting, as it were, on top of that, a Platonic superstructure. Nevertheless, the commitment to Aristotelian physics was hard to reconcile with the Abrahamic religions. First of all, because Aristotle seems committed not to the creation of the world in any way, but to the eternity of the world. Seems to be his view that it has existed forever, was never brought into being, even in the way that Plato describes. Secondly, it is not clear that Aristotle is committed, as Plato is, to the soul as a transcendent entity that can survive the death of the body. This is very important to Plato. And he has Socrates give a speech about the immortality of the soul as Socrates is about to undergo his death, execution. Aristotle does not seem to be committed to that. Again, there were different interpretations, and there were some who tried to find a way of interpreting Aristotle's treatise on the soul, De Anima, so that it would in fact be committed to a transcendent soul. And what they mostly came up with, a view that Maimonides later shared, was the idea that although the human soul is not by its nature immortal, it can become immortal. And the idea is that if you contemplate the ideas, the higher ideas, sufficiently, this becomes part of your very being, and to that extent, when your body passes away, the mind, the intellect that has attached itself to the higher ideas and to what's known in Aristotle as the active intellect will survive and continue doing what it does. Again, whether that's really there in Aristotle is another question, but it was believed in the Middle Ages by many Aristotelians that this was indeed Aristotle's view. But still, it was controversial. And the general idea of Aristotle that the world has a fixed nature, that it is the subject of study in the physical sciences, this seemed to many to conflict with the divine freedom to intervene in the world, to guide the world providentially, and to create miracles. So in all these ways, it was not so straightforward to reconcile Aristotle with the three Abrahamic religions as it was to reconcile Platonism with them. So Al-Farabi revives Aristotelianism within the Islamic context in the 10th century, and comes under attack in the 11th century by Al-Ghazali, massively influential figure in Islam, wrote a famous book called The Incoherence of the Philosophers, and he says that certain of the philosophers' opinions are worthy of death, which was rather harsh. And that put a bit of a damper on the conversation. There was a reply by Ibn Rushd, also known in the West as Averroes, who is a close contemporary of Maimonides and actually came from the same city originally, but they never met. Although towards the end of his life, Maimonides did read Ibn Rushd's commentaries on Aristotle, at least some of them, and he liked them very much, we know from a letter. Ibn Rushd wrote a book called The Incoherence of the Incoherence. But it seems clear that it was Al-Ghazali who won the day within the Islamic world. Within the 12th century, Aristotelianism was brought into Jewish philosophy. The first of whom we know, the first Jewish Aristotelian of whom we know in this period is Avraham ibn Daud. And this is all in the Iberian Peninsula, which is at the time ruled by Muslims. And Maimonides grew up in that context. He says, this is my tradition. He doesn't think he's innovating so much, although as we'll see, he does innovate in one very crucial respect. He says, this is my father's tradition, and we all have this view. And maybe that was true in the very particular community where he lived. It was certainly not generally true within the Jewish world. And within the 12th century also, we see it spreading to the Latin West. And this is a question partly of the actual translation of the works of Aristotle. So most people did not read Greek in those days. And there were translations made into Arabic, which had not been available before, and then into Hebrew, and then into Latin. And the Jews were very often the intermediaries here, so going back and forth between the Islamic and Christian realms and translating. So we find the teaching of Aristotelian philosophy at Paris in the late 12th and early 13th century. But there was very quickly a backlash there as well. Right? So by the beginning of the 13th century, by 1200, Maimonides' Guide had just appeared, and Aristotle's Corpus was now available in its pretty much in its entirety in Latin. 1210, you get the first condemnation in Paris. May have been the Pope involved, it's not too clear. Condemnation of the teaching of Aristotelian physics. Now, these condemnations were made, it's not clear that they had any effect. Often the condemnation tells you what was going on, not that it actually stopped. And certainly didn't have any effect anywhere else. And in fact, some other schools started to advertise, well, if you have a problem getting your course in Aristotelian physics in Paris, come to us instead. And it was certainly being taught at Oxford and other places. Around the same time, we're getting the first Maimonidean controversies. So Maimonides passed away in 1204, and the first controversy was during the last few years of his life. And it concerned, I'll say a bit more about this shortly, it really concerned the issue that I mentioned about the immortality of the soul, acquiring immortality. So I'll get back to that in a minute. And then 1230 to 1235, a bigger Maimonidean controversy, really concerning the Guide. And this was largely centered in Provence, or in Languedoc, which was in southeastern France, now, as we now say, but it was a separate kingdom. There was a large Jewish community there, and it was an amazing place, sort of trading place between the Christian and the Islamic world as far as Jews were concerned. And this trading took place intellectually as well as commercially. So this was the place where translations were made of Arabic works such as Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed into Hebrew. And many of the philosophical works were translated, especially by the Ibn Tibbon family in that area at the time. And then these works start to move north. And in the northern areas of Ashkenaz, France and Germany, they simply had no philosophical tradition to speak of. They knew a little bit about Saadia Gaon, but they knew very little else. And they were quite shocked by Maimonides' radical philosophical works. So the Ashkenazi rabbis get drawn into the controversy, which was really started by the anti-rationalists in Provence, and that led to what everybody agreed was a disaster. The Christians heard about it. They said, "Oh, yes, this is a terrible work," and they burnt Maimonides' code in 1232. The Dominican order burnt it, and even the anti-Maimonideans felt pretty bad about that. They did not like the idea of Christians burning Jewish books, and that led to the dying down of the controversy, at least for the time being. And I think it was partly as a result of that Maimonides really became not beyond criticism, but to some extent untouchable. I think they were worried, even the anti-Maimonideans were worried, if they go too far in this criticism, they're going to bring the Christian church upon them. And this is a time of great upheaval in the Christian church in the area. There's the Cathar heresy in the area and so on. The church is trying to impose a certain orthodoxy which really didn't exist until then on the whole area of southeastern France and northern Italy. Meanwhile, more condemnations in Paris, but also the development of Aristotelianism as reconciled with Christianity. So someone like Thomas Aquinas has read Maimonides, is very influenced by Maimonides' reconciliation of Aristotelianism with Judaism, and he wants to do the same kind of thing with Christianity. The controversies did not end and went through to the 14th century, and since then they have been revived periodically. Probably the most virulent anti-rationalist statements, I think, come from the 15th and early 16th century, right after the expulsion from Spain in 1492. So certain anti-rationalists blamed philosophers for the expulsion. They said, as Jews will do when things go bad, they said, what did we do wrong? And of course, they blamed the rationalist culture of Spanish Jewry. So there are some very strong words written about that, which will get quoted again and again whenever this topic comes up. But as I said at the beginning, what's amazing is that Maimonides, at the same time, wrote the only real code of Jewish law. That is to say, it's exhaustive. All the other codes are for practical purposes, so they don't cover the entirety of Jewish law. Maimonides covers everything, even laws concerning the temple that have no practical application today. I'll say more about that in a minute. Who is reading the...
They're all reading these books and different points of view and criticizing each other.
Yes. And
it wasn't the average person, the average peasant in there.
Right.
Wherever.
It is hard or impossible for us to say now how big the intellectual elite really was. I don't know how many educated people there were at the time. And of course we tend to have books and documents that survive from the educated people. So it's hard to say much at this point about the others. You have to do that on the basis of archaeology and material culture, and then how would you distinguish between who the Jews were and who the non-Jews were? It would be very hard to do. So I agree that our history is rather skewed in that way. We know much more about intellectuals and educated people than we do about anybody else.
Did the kings read this stuff and sit around the court?
There was certainly occasional kings who did, but I think for the most part, no.
This was like elite group who were out there doing their own thing.
Yeah, I think to some extent. But, there were certainly, how can I say, significant numbers. It's hard to know even how many Jews there were in Languedoc at the time, so unless there was some royal census or something like that. But I don't know the social history terribly well, but I think it would be very hard to reconstruct.
Did the popes get drawn into this?
Oh, not very much, no. This was mostly local. As I say, there's some question about whether Pope Gregory was involved in the 1210 condemnation. But all of the other things are done by local bishops or by the theology faculty in Paris.
I would suspect that the monks usually dealt with it, and but on the Jewish side, who would deal with it, the rabbis?
Yes. But I mean, there was obviously no organized institution like the church in Jewish societies. There was nothing quite like that.
So like the rabbis speaking to each other?
Yes. And there were certainly schools, there were yeshivot, there were academies in all these places. Not very institutionally settled, but they existed.
So what did it all mean if you have these men talking to one another
Mhm.
and that's the end of it?
Yes. That's how life in intellectual life in antiquity and in the Middle Ages mostly proceeded, I would think. Yes.
When did Spinoza come along in this?
So
period?
Spinoza is not till the 17th century. So very much educated in the Maimonidean tradition, but much later. So he's already at the beginning of during the scientific revolution. Okay, so now let me go back to the main handout, the issues that gave rise to the Maimonidean controversies. So one is the issue that we talked about last time, whether God has a body. So in Maimonides' code, the Mishneh Torah, he says the following. He talks about the people who have no share in the world to come and are cut off, destroyed, and excommunicated forever on account of their very great sins and wickedness. And one category is called a heretic, or in Hebrew a min. And he has 5 types of heretic. And one of the 5 types is one who admits that there is a single God, but that he has a body and a form. Now, first of all, Maimonides was the first legalist to even try to codify belief in this way. Nobody had ever done that. Belief, there are some occasional statements in the Talmud about what one should not say or should not believe, but there's nothing like a systematically worked out theology or dogma or anything like that. Maimonides wanted to do it, and he included this in his code. Now, one of the first commentators, still very important and still printed in every published edition of the code, is Avraham ben David of Poskier, who's known as the Rabbad, or the Raavad. And he's a contemporary of Maimonides who's living in the Provence area. So this work, the Mishneh Torah, which was written in Hebrew, comes to Provence. He doesn't really know who Maimonides is. Maimonides is in Egypt. But, what an amazing work. This is a great thing, and it requires some investigation. So the Rabbad wrote comments on the code, often saying, I have no idea where he's getting this from, or what is he talking about, or something like that. And it's important, and we'll come back to it, that Maimonides never gave sources. He just said, this is the way it is. Very rarely quotes alternative opinions. There's a reason for that, which we'll get to. So the comment there by the Rabbad is as follows. He says, why has he called such a person a heretic? That is to say, a person who believes that God has a body. There are many people greater than and superior to him who adhere to such a belief on the basis of what they have seen in verses of scripture, and even more in the words of those agadot, that is to say the legends or the narrative parts of Talmud and Midrash, which corrupt right opinion about religious matters. Now, just based on that, what do you think the Rabbad actually believes? Does he think that God has a body? No, he clearly rejects it, right? And he thinks that these midrashic traditions corrupt right opinion about religious matters. At the same time, he says, look, I can understand why people would think this. If you just read the Bible and you read the traditional rabbinic interpretation, that's a natural thing to think. These people are not so educated. Call them heretics and kick them out of the world to come. That's a bit too harsh. And in fact, the Rabbad represents the traditional philosophical view of Jews, which is, no, it's not the right opinion, but, okay, we have to have some pity on these people. Maimonides is totally unrelenting and uncompromising.
And this one seems maybe unrelenting. Isn't that a dig to Christians?
Um,
Who wrote this?
I think it is not, although he certainly did think that Christianity was very problematic. As we'll see, many Jews, it's hard to know how many, but many Jewish texts, I would say, do seem to be committed to some sort of corporeality. Mystical texts describe in some detail the body of God. So we can jump ahead to that if you like. And I think that's clearly his main target. Let's see, what is that? Yeah, okay, if you look at page 3, the bottom of page 3, the last text there is from Hechalot Rabbati, which is a rabbinic text. It's hard to say exactly when it originates, and it's typical of many such texts, and it goes on to describe the stature of God in astronomically large figures. Right? So, his stature is 230 and 6,000 of myriads of parasangs. Some debate about it's an Iranian measure of distance. How big it is unclear. Some people say it's about 3.5 miles if it's a human parasang. However, there are some texts that suggest that in divine measures, it's more like 19.2 trillion miles. So this is, as I say, astronomically large. From the ball of the right eye to the ball of the left eye, there be 30 myriads of parasangs. The width of his right eye is 3 myriads of parasangs, and so on and so on. These are, again, we have no idea how many people read these texts, but they are rabbinic texts. And they were considered part of the Jewish tradition.
Prior to
Yes, they probably come from the 2nd or 3rd century CE. Some people think that earlier. Well, it's hard to know because the manuscript tradition we have goes back to about the 8th or 9th century. So they're presented as in the name of Tannaitic rabbis like Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Akiva. But we've no idea historically what the case is.
But to be so specific says that you had to measure that,
Yes.
God. So,
Yes.
It's quite incredible that they would have the chutzpah.
Yes.
to
So
say
these are
that.
based on mystical experiences, revelations by angels, and mystical journeys where you would go through the different palace gates. Heichal means a palace or a temple. You would go through the different levels of the palaces towards the divine throne, and this information would be revealed. But whether it's meaningful or whether it's meant to boggle our minds with the enormity, the immensity of God, which defies comprehension, is hard to say. In any event, Maimonides was completely opposed to it. So I think it's not really targeting Christianity, but Judaism of this kind, which was very prevalent.
But
yes.
Maimonides, he related a lot to Arabs from what I used to know.
Yeah.
And he's multicultural.
Well, he's living in an Islamic environment. He's speaking and writing in Arabic, except for many of his halachic works, which are in Hebrew. And he's educated in Islamic science and philosophy.
So his point of view would be consistent with Muslim religion.
Well, to some extent, but he does not think there's a tension on this issue. Right? The Muslims were very, very critical of corporeality of God views. They thought that the Christian belief was absurd, and they also criticized these Jewish traditions. So some Jews responded by saying, well, we have ways of interpreting them. Just like we can interpret the Bible allegorically, we can interpret these rabbinic traditions allegorically too. Maimonides says, no, there's some stuff we just have to throw out. We're not throwing out the Bible, we're not throwing out the Talmud, but this tradition about the shiur koma, the measure of God's stature, he thinks should be totally rejected and burnt. So that
It's
was,
almost like creating an idol
yes,
in a mathematical sense.
right. That's certainly what Maimonides thought. But again, it's clear that these traditions were very prevalent. So, for example, prayers like Aleinu seem to be related, although there's nothing in Aleinu about this, but some of the prayers that we have, the Kedusha, Aleinu, and so on, seem to be related to these texts that describe these journeys. And in the journeys, they learn information about the extent of God. Okay, so that's the first issue. Second issue is about the immortality of the soul. Now, the particular issue in which this arose for Maimonides was that Jews are committed to the resurrection of the body. It's a prophecy that the body will eventually be resurrected. Well, if Maimonides is correct, and what happens when you die is that either you, if you have not succeeded philosophically, you just disappear, or on the other hand, you become a philosopher, and your mind engages with ideas, and it continues to engage with ideas on that transcendent level even after the death of the body. Why would someone who has attained the high level of leaving their body now want to be put back in the body? What would be the purpose? It's supposed to be an escape from the body that you have attained, a sort of liberation. And Maimonides doesn't say very much about it, the resurrection, at least in his original work. So, for example, he says, this is B in the Laws of Repentance, in the world to come there is neither body nor anything corporeal, but only the souls of the righteous without bodies, like ministering angels. So the Rabbad, who I mentioned before, says in his comment on this, in my eyes the words of this person are like those of one who says that there is no resurrection except for souls. And this was the first Maimonidean controversy. Maimonides responded, he was still alive, with a treatise on resurrection and said, I do believe in it, it's a prophecy so I have to. And he says, look, I believe that there will be a resurrection of the body just as was promised. The world, however, will not change its nature, and according to the laws of physics, anything that is corporeal will ultimately decay. So he said, look, there will be these bodies, and they may last a bit longer. Maybe medical science will be better in the Messianic age. Remember, he was also a physician. We'll be able to keep people alive longer, but ultimately, it's a body, it's going to wear out. And then the mind will keep going. So that satisfied people to some extent, but it still seems as though he is committed to the resurrection because he has to be committed to it, and it's not really playing the central role that it did for many other Jews. So Nachmanides later on will be very critical of Maimonides for this. He said, that's not really the Jewish view. Jewish view is that you get resurrected, maybe you get a special body, God changes the laws of nature or something, but that's going to last for a long time, maybe forever.
But isn't, I thought the thinking is the resurrection would not happen on an individual basis, but would happen on, everybody would be resurrected at the same time.
Yes, right, everybody at the same time. A view, by the way, that would make this even more difficult to understand was not held by Maimonides, probably. It was held by his contemporary Ibn Rushd. And that is that the mind that succeeds in engaging the ideas and therefore becomes immortal also loses its individuality. It just merges with the collective mind. So if that's the case, how is there any individual soul left even to go back into the body? So that's, since many of Maimonides' successors among the Jews were followers of Averroes, this became a big problem in the next few generations. Averroes, or Ibn Rushd, was expelled by the Muslim rulers, and he went to live with the Jews. And he did not become Jewish, but his influence was among the Jews and the Christians, not among the Muslims. But I think the most radical thing that Maimonides did was to attempt to reform the curriculum. For Jews, that's the most sacred thing. If you touch the yeshiva curriculum, you're in big trouble. And Talmud has been central to the yeshiva curriculum for a long time, since Babylonia, somewhere in the, 3rd to the 8th century. Okay, so I'm not going to read out all of these texts, but I'm going to explain what they say. So the Mishnah talks about certain doctrines which may only be taught under certain special conditions and not to everybody. So one is Maaseh Bereshit, the account of the creation. And one is Maaseh Merkavah, the account of the chariot. And this is to do with the prophetic vision of the divine chariot. By Ezekiel, exactly. What are these traditions? Well, there were mystical traditions about creation, and there were mystical traditions about the chariot. And in fact, this Shiur Koma material, which I mentioned before, about the extent of God's body. That the people who wrote that were called the Yordei Merkava, those who went down to the chariot. This was part of their vision. That was the traditional understanding of these terms. Maimonides, in the commentary on the Mishnah, which some people say he wrote as early as the age of 19, does give an important innovation, and it seems to come from him. And he says at the very beginning, this is at the bottom of page 1, and here from me, I myself, what has become clear to me. It's clear he's not saying something from his tradition, but from himself. He says, account of the creation means physics, and account of the chariot means metaphysics, the basic structure of reality. Well, that is a huge change. And he says, this is what the philosophers study. Right? So that's very important. Those become the highest disciplines of Torah study for Maimonides. Highest disciplines of Torah study are the philosophical disciplines of physics and metaphysics. And in his code, he also says the same thing. And this is very connected to the reason why he wrote the code at all. He explains in the preface that it's very complicated in his day to figure out what the halakha is and to really know the Torah. It's very complicated. The Talmud is complicated. In addition to the Talmud, there are Gaonic writings and so on. How do you find your way around this? He says, I'm going to make it much easier for you. The reason why he wants to make it easier is this. Because nobody ever gets to, or very few people ever get to, the highest disciplines. Namely, following what I just said, the study of philosophy. Jewish philosophy, which is identical with what Aristotle calls physics and metaphysics. Now, if you're going to spend your entire time studying the Talmud, if you even manage that, you're going to be confused. No, he says that's wrong. He says, I'm going to help you. So he's going to give you a summary of the results of the Talmud. So if we go on to the bottom of page 2, in the laws of Torah study, citing a Talmudic passage, he says you should divide your study into 3 parts. 1/3 for the written Torah, Tanakh, or scripture. 1/3 for oral Torah, Torah Shebaal Peh. And 1/3, he says, to understand and comprehend what one learnt in the first 2/3 by deriving one thing from another, and that's Talmud. He does not define Talmud as a book. Talmud is a method of investigation, inference and investigation. And what is part of Talmud? Well, he also says that matters of tradition are part of written Torah, the explanations of the tradition are part of oral Torah, and Pardes is part of Talmud. Pardes comes from the Persian word for the orchard. What he means by that is the highest esoteric disciplines, the highest subject matters of study. Because in the Talmud, it refers to the rabbis who entered the Pardes, who entered the orchard, because they delved into these very dangerous but very important areas of study. So what does he mean by that? Well, what he will say is that Pardes consists of Maseh Breshit and Maseh Merkava, the study of creation and the study of the chariot. In other words, Pardes is philosophy. So philosophy is part of Talmud, and Talmud is the highest and most difficult part of Torah study. Now, Maimonides goes on to say, look, you should not go into this orchard until you're properly prepared. You have to know the basics first, and that takes a long time. He said, that's why I've given you this code. You can read my code. You don't have to read the books of the Talmud itself. You know what the halakha is, and now you will be ready if you have the other scientific preparation in your education. You have to know logic and so on. You'll be ready to study physics and metaphysics, which is the highest part of Torah. Well, that is a pretty major revolutionary proposal. Yes?
How did he interpret the 4 that went into the Pardes?
He thinks that if you enter into physics and metaphysics without the proper preparation, in the preliminary sciences, you will make disastrous mistakes, and you may come out to think that God has a body, and so on. And this is dangerous stuff.
So, in his view, the only one who came out
Yes.
whole was Rabbi Akiva.
Rabbi Akiva, yes.
So he is the ultimate best man.
Yes, that's right, yes. So he must have had the proper preparation, both halachic and moral education first, and the proper philosophical scientific education.
So it means that only select people
Yes.
can come home.
Absolutely, yes. And that's what, so Maimonides is very careful about that. However, at the same time, as that he preserves these areas of metaphysics and physics for the elite, he also thinks that even the masses need some philosophical education, because corporeality, the view that God has a body, is so bad. He thinks it's worse than idolatry. Right? So the code, the Mishnah Torah, includes statements about God not having a body, as we've seen, and says that anyone who believes that, even though that would be a quite natural belief for an uneducated person, is completely to be expelled and will have no place in the world to come, and so on. So Maimonides is an elitist, but at the same time, there are certain philosophical matters that he thinks everybody needs to know, children, women, and so on, he says. Everybody, even women.
Even women.
And he says that, right, because for the most part, women did not have the adequate education, but nevertheless, this they need to know. And that goes against the view of someone like the Rabbad, who would have said, well, leave the uneducated people alone, let them have the beliefs that they have. They mean well, and, but no, Maimonides really is changing the whole education system here. And this is what I think really created some of the controversies. Right? So there was a more moderate philosophical tradition before that, in which philosophy was studied, but it was not understood to be part of Torah itself, let alone the highest part, and in which philosophy was kept only for the elite, and you didn't have to bother everybody else with it. Whereas for Maimonides, it is for the elite, but you have to bother people with some things. And that's why the beginning of his code is the Book of Knowledge. Here are the things you need to know. And he summarizes Aristotelian physics and so on, and some metaphysics, because he thinks every person needs to know this. Not just the educated elite, but everybody. So that's already quite dangerous.
But if he thinks that,
Yes.
you could think everybody should be educated, but we know that everybody doesn't necessarily have the ability to be educated. So how does he deal with that?
Right. So and he talks about this at great length, and he's very clear about the reasons, in his view, why not everyone can be, but he still thinks everyone can grasp this much. Which
Regardless of their abilities,
Yes.
they can go.
And that's why, he felt it was necessary to codify the basic beliefs. And now, as I mentioned last time, we sing them in the form of a hymn, Yigdal, which contains the 13 principles, because he thinks everybody should know this, right? Which includes the statement that, God does not have a body. Which, again, now we all accept that, but to many people it wasn't so obvious, as the Rabbad says. And what do you do then with these traditions that I mentioned that talk about the extent of God's body? And so Maimonides came and he provoked great resistance in a way that no previous Jewish philosopher had done.
Oh, maybe I'm getting ahead of the story.
Yes.
But how did Maimonides eventually accept
Well,
into the Jewish
yes.
as a part of the Jewish tradition?
Part of it is that the Mishnah Torah itself is such a monumental work that it would be hard to put it aside. But I think that what ultimately happened, and it started pretty early already with the Rabbad, is that people started studying the Mishnah Torah for the exact opposite purpose from the one that Maimonides intended. Right? So we've got this work without any sources, because he said, I don't want you to go and look at the Talmud. I bothered myself to go and read it, I mastered it, I'm telling you the results, now go do something else. But instead you've got this work, and you think, where is he getting this from? You think, maybe he's interpreting the passage over here in Masechet Megillah, but how does that reconcile with something else in Masechet Shabbat? oh, maybe I can do it this way. So we get a whole literature, starting at the end of his life, of commentaries on the Mishneh Torah. And it becomes a way of looking at the Talmud. And to this day, that is one of the main ways in which in yeshivot one studies Talmud. You start with something in the Mishneh Torah, in the Maimonides Code, and you try and figure out where he's getting it from. How must he have interpreted the Talmudic text in order to come to this conclusion? And it turns out, because he was a very systematic, rigorous thinker, that people have constructed all kinds of elaborate interpretations, some of which are very good, which he wouldn't have come up with otherwise, of the Talmud, in order to get to his results. But then it's not because you care about the results themselves, you care about the interpretation. And it just becomes more Talmud, which is not what he wanted. So he became part of the curriculum. But as I say, there was no getting away from the fact that even in the Mishneh Torah itself, in the first book, the book of knowledge, there is all this philosophy. And of course, in the Moreh Nevuchim, in the Guide to the Perplexed, that's again it's all basically, it is a philosophical book. It's a philosophical book about the interpretation of the Bible. So those books became canonical books on the Jewish bookshelf. There's no getting away from that. And no matter how many people tell you, well, you know, it's dangerous stuff, you shouldn't read it, to a lot of people, including my younger self, that was just a provocation. I wanted to read it.
Of course.
And there it was on the shelf. I didn't have to go to some other place.
What does the word Mishnah mean?
Oh, good. Thank you for asking. Okay, so Mishnah it means to repeat or to learn by repeating. But even the term Mishneh Torah is very provocative. And in yeshivas these days, people do not call Maimonides Code by that name. Mishneh Torah is a term that comes from the Chumash, from Deuteronomy, Tvarim, and it says that the king should have a copy, Mishneh Torah, a repetition of the Torah, with him, to symbolize that the king is not above the law, but the law is above the king. So by saying Mishneh Torah, Maimonides was saying, this is my repetition of the Torah. You don't need to go and consult anything else. This is a complete copy. So instead in yeshivot they call it Yad HaChazakah, because it has 14 books, so Yud Dalet. But they don't like to use that term. So it's a striking name. It's a very daring project. Very daring.
Oh, he's very daring.
Yes.
Did he have other people working with him, as far as we know?
He had students. We don't know of too many students who remained with him, but we know of them from letters. I mean, there may have been students, but we only have the documentary evidence, so he only wrote letters to people that were away. So we know about people who lived in other places who, he was like, in fact, the whole of the guide is written in the form of a letter to a student who has had to leave. But it's hard to know how many. And then his son was a close follower of his, and his family were the leading Jewish figures in Egypt for a number of generations. And in some communities, including in Yemen, Maimonides became the authoritative halachic figure, and they did everything according to his code. That did not happen in Europe, in Northern Europe, but still, it is in the form of annotations to Maimonides' code that you can find out what the Ashkenazi customs and halachic decisions are. So this,
The commentaries, the
Yes.
are commentaries on his.
yes, right, for a number of centuries. So if I look at, let's see, number 3 on page 3, the very first word that Maimonides explains in the Guide of the Perplexed, and he says this is a book to explain difficult words, and it's written in Arabic, so he's using the Arabic translation as well. The first word is salam. And the reason he's explaining this word is because of the idea in the Chumash that human beings were created b'tselem Elokim, in the image of God. And this idea lies behind the Shiur Kama tradition about the extent of God's body. if we were created in God's image and we have a bodily form, surely God must also have some sort of bodily form. Maybe it is much greater than ours, it is immense, it is powerful, and so on, but it must be something like ours. That's a perfectly natural thing to think, and there's a very ancient Jewish tradition to that extent, which is reflected in many mystical works, which continued throughout Kabbalah. Now, they probably didn't mean it's literally a physical body, but they meant it has something like a physical form, whatever that means. And that's why Maimonides says, no, nothing corporeal at all. It doesn't mean that. Instead, for him, Tselem means intellect. Right? The sense in which we're made in the image of God is that we are capable of grasping ideas, and that is, although even to say that of God would be problematic, it's the closest we can get to saying anything positive about God for Maimonides. And this is a problem for rationalist philosophy in Judaism. Right? God says, I'm creating mankind in my image, or in our image, but at the same time, and Philo of Alexandria had emphasized this, it says elsewhere in Tanakh that God is not comparable to anything else, not comparable to anything created, or to the gods, and so on. Right? Mi kamocha, who is like you? And for Philo and his followers among the philosophers, that meant that God cannot be compared to anything, and therefore, of course, God doesn't have a body like other physical things do. And so how do you reconcile those things? Well, Maimonides says that Tselem Elokim is the intellect. But, as I mentioned, there was this other way of understanding it, which understood it to mean there must be something like a divine body. And I already read this passage from Heichal Rabati. So, what followed from this, I'll move to the concluding part about anti-rationalism on page 4. Well, in 1305, so that is during the Fourth Maimonidean controversy, a ban was issued in Barcelona by Rabbi Shlomo ben Adret, who's known as the Rashba. And you have to read it very carefully, however. Right? He says this, that no one from the sons of our community, that is to say in Barcelona, should study the books that the Greeks composed concerning physics and metaphysics, whether they are composed in their language or translated into another, for 50 years from today, until that person is 25, and that no one from the sons of our community should teach these sciences to anyone who's less than 25. So that is not exactly a complete ban. Right? First of all, there's an age limit, and the idea was that just like Kabbalah, you're only able to learn these things if you're of a certain age and maturity, and presumably you've also studied enough Torah that you already know the halakha and so on. So 25. So it's an advanced subject. Secondly, by the way, it says you should not study the books that the Greeks composed. What about books that Jews composed on these matters? This would appear to be excluded from the ban. You could teach those to people from earlier. So you could teach Maimonides' works to people earlier on. Thirdly, it's a local ban. It's in Barcelona. And fourthly, it's for 50 years from today. It's got a time limit. Now, people to this day will go back to this ban and tell you, in some circles, that studying philosophy is prohibited by rabbinic law, but that's clearly not the case. This was a very restricted issue, and it was meant to diffuse this controversy that was going on. And the second thing that happened was Kabbalah, as we now call it, emerged, which is to say, look, Kabbalah means tradition, and there were Jewish mystical texts long before that, but now it became something like a normative, fixed, more or less fixed tradition. Work like the Zohar appeared, and these works were studied and maybe written by people who had been educated in philosophy. Even if they then turned against Maimonides, they were educated in his books, and it shows in their thinking and in their vocabulary. So when the Kabbalists say that, high above the Sfirot above the supernal emanations is the highest level of God is Ein Sof, it's the infinite. This is a philosophical term that they are translating into Hebrew. Right? They're getting that from philosophy. And they would have said that much that Maimonides said about the impossibility of saying anything positive about God, that applies to the Ein Sof, but not to other levels of God. There were also arguments made that there was a rabbinic ban already in the time of the Mishnah against studying philosophy. These arguments are not very convincing. The term Chachma Yavanit is used in the Mishnah. Some people translate it Greek wisdom, but then it would be, you would think the Hebrew would be Chachmat Yavan, the wisdom of Greece. Chachma Yavanit seems to have something to do with the language Greek. And in fact, the early commentators, before the Maimonidean controversies, never say that this is philosophy. What they say is that it is some kind of method of using signs to communicate across distances. I don't know if it was semaphore or what. Right? Only during the Maimonidean controversies do the anti-rationalists say, oh, you know what, it's philosophy that the rabbis were banning. That was a new interpretation that was called for because of the politics of the moment. In any event, no matter how virulent it became, the criticism of philosophy, still, as I mentioned, the Mishneh Torah became a canonical work on the Jewish bookshelf, and there was no way to avoid it. Now, that does not mean that Maimonides won the day in another sense. Kabbalah became much more prevalent than philosophy. Most people thought Kabbalah was the high discipline of Torah and not philosophy, except in a few isolated circles. But it was always there. So that, for example, when you look to the scientific revolution and to Jews who start to get involved in it, I'm going to stop with this, or you look to the Haskalah, the Enlightenment of the 18th, 19th century, these were people who first, during their traditional rabbinic education, became interested in Maimonides. And they studied Maimonides, and then they began to criticize Maimonides. So, for example, Maimonides gives you, in the beginning of book 2 of the guide, a very nice summary of Aristotelian physics in a form of a set of axioms. So some of the leading contributors from a Jewish point of view, to the modern philosophy of physics and so on, first read that, and then they encountered modern physics, modern ideas about physics, and they criticized Maimonides, but they retained some of his ideas. So we see in the 18th century the reprinting of Maimonidean works that had not been studied for some time. And as I say, these books were available to them, at least to individuals. That was radically different from the Islamic situation, although it also is different from the Christian situation, because there was no equivalent of the university in Judaism or Islam, really. The university in Christian realms in Europe became a corporation which had its own self-governance and had at least a relative freedom from the local church. And they could fight that out politically, regardless of what they might have had the same views, but people wanted their independence. So eventually that would become a nice institutional setting for Christians and Jews to engage in critical thinking.
So today in the yeshivot, Maimonides is studied?
It depends where. Maimonides' code is studied everywhere, Yeshivat Torah. Where the yeshiva that I went to, for example, which is the main yeshiva in Europe, once one of my teachers quoted something from Maimonides' guide, and everybody gasped. And he looked around, and he said, I saw it quoted somewhere else. So it was on the bookshelf. And but it was considered so dangerous that you could barely look at it, which only made me want to read it more.
Of course.
Thank you.
I thought it was Maimonides was working so that he could reach the regular people rather than the elite. And it certainly, as you read this lesson,
Well, I think he had, he did try to reach the regular people as well, and that's very much there in the code. The